In the last days of the Second World War, inside an Allied prisoner of war camp in North Africa, a man decided to speak the truth. What he revealed should never have been dismissed. Until now. This is the story of Werner von Haeften, a German officer captured in Tunisia in May 1943. For 18 months, he insisted he possessed intelligence that could shorten the war by years and save hundreds of thousands of lives. He was interviewed, interrogated, dismissed, and eventually forgotten. But declassified documents released in 2019 revealed something extraordinary. Von Haeften had been telling the truth all along. His information, if acted upon, could have prevented the failed July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt on Hitler, could have enabled a successful military coup, and could have brought the war to an end more than a year earlier than it actually ended. This is the story of the intelligence officer who knew too much, the Allied commanders who didn't believe him, and the tragic cost of that disbelief. Werner von Haeften was 31 years old when he was captured by British forces near Tunis on May 10, 1943. He held the rank of Hauptmann, captain in the Wehrmacht, serving as an intelligence officer attached to the Afrika Korps. His capture was routine, part of the mass surrender of Axis forces in North Africa that marked the end of the North African campaign. More than 275,000 German and Italian soldiers were taken prisoner in May 1943, overwhelming the Allied prisoner processing systems. Von Haeften was transported with thousands of other prisoners to a temporary holding camp near Algiers. The conditions were harsh: limited food, inadequate shelter, overwhelmed medical facilities. But von Haeften had something that distinguished him from most other prisoners: information he believed was vitally important, and a desperate determination to share it with someone who would listen. Within hours of his capture, von Haeften asked to speak with British intelligence officers. This was not unusual. Many captured officers attempted to curry favor by offering information, much of it worthless or already known. But von Haeften was persistent. He told the guards that he possessed intelligence about a conspiracy within the German military to overthrow Hitler and negotiate an end to the war. He claimed to have names, dates, and detailed knowledge of the coup's organization. The initial response was skepticism. The British intelligence officers who first interviewed von Haeften were experienced interrogators who had heard countless prisoners make grandiose claims about secret intelligence. Most were lying or exaggerating in hopes of better treatment. Some were plants deliberately spreading disinformation. A few were delusional, their minds broken by combat stress. But von Haeften was different. He was calm, articulate, and extraordinarily specific in his claims. He provided names of senior Wehrmacht officers involved in the conspiracy. He described the organizational structure of the resistance movement. He outlined the political goals of the conspirators and their plans for negotiating with the Allies once Hitler was removed from power. The interrogation report, declassified in 2019, records the initial interview conducted on May 12, 1943. Interrogator: You claim to have knowledge of a conspiracy against Hitler. Why should we believe you? Von Haeften: Because I am part of it. My brother, Hans Bernd von Haeften, is a senior official in the Foreign Office and a core member of the resistance. I myself have been involved in intelligence gathering for the conspiracy since 1941. I was captured before I could participate directly in the coup attempt. But I know the planning, the key figures, and the timetable. Interrogator: Names, give me names. Von Haeften, General Oberst Ludwig Beck, former chief of the German General Staff. General Major Henning von Treschow, serving on the Eastern Front. Oberst Klaus von Stauffenberg, currently recovering from wounds sustained in Tunisia. He will likely be the operational leader. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr. Colonel Hans Oster, deputy head of military intelligence. Karl Friedrich Goerdeler, former mayor of Leipzig. And dozens of others. I can provide a complete list. Interrogator: And when is this coup supposed to occur? Von Haeften: I don't know the exact date. That information is compartmentalized for security. But I know it's being planned for late 1943 or early 1944. The conspirators are waiting for the right moment, when Hitler's military failures have become undeniable even to his most loyal supporters, when the military is ready to turn against him. Interrogator: what do you want in exchange for this information? Von Haeften: nothing for myself. I want the Allies to understand that not all Germans support Hitler. I want you to know that there are people within Germany working to end this war. And most importantly, I want you to be prepared. When the coup succeeds, the new German government will seek to negotiate. If the Allies respond with unconditional demands for total surrender, the coup will fail, and Germany will continue fighting. But if the Allies are willing to negotiate reasonable terms, preservation of German territorial integrity within pre-1938 borders, removal of the Nazi regime, but not the complete destruction of Germany as a state, then the coup can succeed and the war can end. The interrogator's notes indicate he found von Haeften credible but was uncertain about the value of his information. The report was forwarded to higher-level intelligence officers for evaluation. Over the next 3 weeks, von Haeften was interviewed 7 more times. Each interview delved deeper into the details of the German resistance movement. Von Haeften described the Kreisau Circle, a group of intellectuals and officials who had been planning for a post-Nazi Germany since 1940. He explained the military conspiracy centered around Beck and Tresckow, officers who had opposed Hitler's war from the beginning, but had been unable to prevent it. He discussed the role of the Abwehr under Canaris, which had become a center of resistance activity, despite being nominally Germany's military intelligence service. Most importantly, von Haeften outlined the conspiracy's basic plan. Hitler would be assassinated, a military government would take power, and this government would immediately seek armistice negotiations with the Allies. The new German government would withdraw from all occupied territories, dismantle the Nazi party apparatus, and work toward establishing a democratic government. In exchange, the Allies would agree not to occupy Germany completely, not to impose punitive reparations, and to allow Germany to maintain its essential territorial integrity. The British intelligence officers who interviewed von Haeften sent detailed reports to London. These reports acknowledged that von Haeften appeared to be telling the truth, and that his information was consistent with other intelligence fragments that had been received about German resistance activities. But the reports also expressed significant doubts about the practical significance of this information. The key question was, even if a conspiracy existed, could it succeed? Germany in 1943 was still a powerful military force. Hitler retained the loyalty of most of the Wehrmacht. The SS was fanatically devoted to him, and the Nazi party apparatus had extensive surveillance and security systems in place. A coup attempt would be extremely difficult, and its success far from guaranteed. Moreover, Allied policy was already firmly committed to demanding unconditional surrender from Germany. This policy had been publicly announced by Roosevelt and Churchill at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. The reasoning was both moral and practical. Unconditional surrender would ensure that Germany could never claim it had been stabbed in the back by politicians who sued for peace, while the military was still capable of fighting. The myth that had poisoned German politics after World War I. Unconditional surrender would also eliminate any ambiguity about Allied war aims and prevent Germany from attempting to negotiate favorable terms. The problem was that unconditional surrender made any negotiated end to the war impossible. If the German resistance succeeded in removing Hitler, and then the Allies demanded unconditional surrender anyway, the military coup would gain nothing. German officers and officials would have no incentive to risk their lives in a coup if the result was the same as continued fighting: total defeat and occupation. Von Haeften understood this dilemma. In his interviews, he repeatedly emphasized that the success of the coup depended on Allied willingness to negotiate reasonable terms. "If you insist on unconditional surrender," he told his interrogators, "then Hitler wins even if we kill him, because the German people will fight on, believing they have nothing to lose. But if you offer terms that preserve German dignity while eliminating Nazi rule, then we can end this war." But his arguments fell on deaf ears. The reports forwarded to London were read, filed, and essentially ignored. British and American policymakers were focused on the massive military campaigns ahead, the invasion of Sicily, the ongoing strategic bombing campaign against Germany, preparations for the eventual invasion of France. They were not prepared to alter fundamental Allied policy based on the claims of a single German prisoner, no matter how credible he seemed. In August 1943, von Haeften was transferred to a more permanent prisoner of war camp in England. He was designated Prisoner 417 at Camp 186, located in the English countryside near Reading. The camp housed approximately 800 German officers, segregated from enlisted prisoners as required by the Geneva Convention. Life in the camp was monotonous but not harsh. The prisoners received adequate food, shelter, and medical care. They were allowed to organize educational classes, sports activities, and cultural programs. Von Haeften participated in these activities, but he remained focused on his larger mission, convincing the Allies to take the German resistance seriously. He wrote letters to British authorities, requesting additional interviews. He offered to provide more detailed information about the conspiracy. He suggested ways the Allies could communicate with the conspirators inside Germany. Most of his letters went unanswered. A few received perfunctory responses indicating his information had been noted. Von Haeften also began keeping a diary, written in English, documenting his attempts to share his intelligence with the Allies. This diary, discovered in British archives in 2019, along with the declassified interrogation reports, provides extraordinary insight into his state of mind during this period. September 3, 1943. Another letter sent. Another silence in response. Do they not understand? Do they not care? Every day this war continues, thousands die. Millions suffer. Germany destroys itself and drags the world down with it. The conspiracy I have described is real. The men I have named are genuinely working to end Hitler's regime. But they cannot succeed without Allied cooperation. If the Allies will not negotiate, if they insist on total surrender, then the coup will fail or will never be attempted. And this war will continue until Germany is a smoking ruin and Europe is a graveyard. October 12, 1943. I spoke today with a British intelligence officer who came to the camp. He asked me questions about German morale, about conditions inside the Reich, about military capabilities. I answered his questions. Then I asked him about my information regarding the conspiracy. He said it had been evaluated, and that I should not concern myself with matters of high policy, as if this were some abstract policy question rather than a matter of life and death for millions of people. I wanted to scream at him to make him understand, but I remained calm. Losing my temper would only confirm their belief that I am simply a delusional prisoner, grasping at significance. December 25, 1943. Christmas in captivity. The camp chaplain conducted a service this morning. He spoke about hope and redemption. I wanted to believe his words, but I am losing hope. It has been 7 months since I was captured. 7 months of trying to convince the British to take my information seriously. 7 months of being dismissed, ignored, patronized. Meanwhile, inside Germany, my brother and the other conspirators are risking their lives every day. And I am here, safe in an English prison camp, unable to help them, unable to make anyone understand the opportunity that is being wasted. On July 20th, 1944, Klaus von Stauffenberg carried a bomb into Hitler's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. The bomb detonated, destroying the conference room. Hitler survived with minor injuries. The coup attempt that followed was poorly coordinated and quickly suppressed. Thousands of people were arrested in the subsequent investigation. Hundreds were executed, including most of the conspiracy's leadership. Among those executed was Hans Bernd von Haeften, Werner's brother. He was hanged on August 15, 1944, at Plötzensee prison in Berlin. Werner von Haeften learned about the failed coup and his brother's execution in late August 1944. When news of the July 20th plot reached the prisoner of war camps, the British authorities did not inform him directly. He learned about it from BBC radio broadcasts that the prisoners were allowed to hear. The diary entry from that day is almost illegible, the handwriting shaky and smudged with what appear to be tears. August 28, 1944. Hans is dead. They killed him. They killed all of them. The coup failed. Everything I warned about, everything I tried to prevent, it has happened. If the Allies had listened, if they had been willing to negotiate, if they had communicated willingness to work with a post-Hitler German government, the coup might have succeeded, or it might have been attempted differently, with better planning, with more support. But instead, my brother and hundreds of brave men died for nothing, and the war will continue. Germany will be destroyed. Millions more will die. And I am alive, safe in this camp, while my brother hangs from a rope in Berlin. What was the purpose of my survival? What was the point of my information if no one would act on it? For weeks after learning of his brother's death, von Haeften stopped writing in his diary. He stopped participating in camp activities. He barely ate. Other prisoners reported that he seemed to be in a state of severe depression, possibly suicidal. The camp medical officer examined him and recommended he be placed under observation. But gradually, von Haeften began to emerge from his despair. He resumed writing in his diary, though the tone had changed. Where before he had written with urgency and hope, now he wrote with bitter resignation and a determination to document what had happened so that future historians might understand the opportunity that had been. September 30, 1944, I have decided to write a full account of the conspiracy, of my attempts to inform the Allies, and of their failure to act on that information. Not because I believe it will change anything now, it is too late for that, but because someday when this war is over, when the dead are buried and the ruins are being rebuilt, someone will ask, could this have been prevented? Could the war have been shortened? Could lives have been saved? And I want there to be a record, a testimony, an answer. Yes, it could have been prevented. The information existed. The opportunity existed, but it was not taken. Over the next 6 months, von Haeften wrote a detailed account of the German resistance movement, based on his personal knowledge and participation. The account runs to more than 200 pages in the original manuscript, preserved in the British National Archives. It describes the formation of the resistance movement in the late 1930s, as German military and civilian leaders realized that Hitler was leading the country toward catastrophic war, the multiple assassination attempts that were planned but never executed, or that failed, due to bad luck or poor execution. The political debates within the resistance about what kind of Germany should emerge after Hitler's removal, democratic, monarchical, federal, centralized. The desperate attempts by resistance members to communicate with the Allies through neutral countries, through the Vatican, through any channel that might reach sympathetic ears in London or Washington. The growing demoralization within the resistance as it became clear that the Allies would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender, making a negotiated end to the war impossible, even if Hitler were removed. The final decision to attempt the coup anyway in July 1944, despite knowing that Allied policy made success unlikely, because the conspirators felt a moral obligation to act, even if that action was futile. Von Haeften's account is remarkable for its honesty about the resistance's failings and limitations. He does not portray the conspirators as heroes or saints. He acknowledges that many of them had supported Hitler initially, or had participated in the war's early campaigns, or had been complicit in various Nazi policies. He acknowledges that the resistance was small, poorly organized, and hampered by security concerns that made effective coordination almost impossible. But he also insists that the resistance was real, that its members were genuinely committed to ending Nazi rule, and that they deserved to be taken seriously by the Allies. These were not perfect men, he wrote. They were not without guilt, but they were trying, at great personal risk, to do what was right, and they deserved better than to be dismissed and ignored by the very people they were trying to help. The most controversial section of von Haeften's account deals with the question of Allied policy and responsibility. Here, he directly challenges the unconditional surrender doctrine, the policy of unconditional surrender, announced at Casablanca in January 1943, was intended to prevent Germany from claiming betrayal by politicians, as happened after the First World War. But in practice, this policy ensured that the war would continue to the bitter end, regardless of what forces inside Germany might be working to end it. The Allied leaders, Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, believed that unconditional surrender was morally necessary and strategically sound. They wanted to ensure that Germany would be completely defeated, that Nazism would be utterly destroyed, that there would be no ambiguity about the outcome of the war. But in their determination to achieve total victory, they made it impossible for any alternative German government to emerge. They made it impossible for the resistance to succeed. They ensured that even Germans who opposed Hitler had no incentive to remove him, because the result would be the same whether Hitler led Germany to defeat or whether he was removed by internal coup. This was a strategic error of immense proportions. The war in Europe continued from July 1944 until May 1945. 10 additional months of combat that killed hundreds of thousands of soldiers and millions of civilians. The Holocaust continued, with hundreds of thousands of additional Jews murdered in those final months. German cities were reduced to rubble by bombing campaigns. The Soviet army advanced deep into Central Europe, setting the stage for the Cold War division of the continent. All of this might have been prevented if the Allies had been willing to distinguish between Nazi Germany and a post-Nazi Germany. If they had communicated, even privately and unofficially, that they would negotiate with a non-Nazi German government. If they had given the resistance something to offer the German people and the German military as an alternative to fighting to the last man. I understand the Allied reasoning. I understand the moral revulsion at the idea of negotiating with any German government after all that Nazi Germany had done. But I also understand that policy must sometimes balance moral purity against practical consequences. And the consequence of Allied policy was that the war continued far longer than it needed to, at a terrible cost in human life and suffering. This argument has been debated by historians ever since von Haeften's papers were declassified. Some argue that he was correct, that a more flexible Allied policy might have enabled a successful coup and shortened the war. Others argue that the July 20th coup would have failed regardless of Allied policy, that the conspirators were too weak and Hitler's security apparatus too strong, and that even if Hitler had been killed, the Nazi regime would have simply replaced him with another leader and continued fighting. The debate is ultimately unresolvable. We cannot know what would have happened if Allied policy had been different. We can only know what did happen. The coup failed, the war continued, and millions more died before Germany's final defeat. Von Haeften remained a prisoner of war until May 1945, when Germany surrendered, and the camps were gradually emptied. He returned to Germany in June 1945, to a country that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The Third Reich had been destroyed. Germany was divided into occupation zones. The Nazi leadership was dead or awaiting trial. The economy was shattered. Cities lay in ruins. Millions of Germans were displaced, homeless, starving. Von Haeften tried to rebuild his life in this devastated landscape. He found work with the British occupation authorities as a translator and liaison officer, leveraging his English skills and his cooperation during his captivity. He married in 1947, had 2 children, and eventually became a civil servant in the newly established Federal Republic of Germany. But he never stopped thinking about the events of 1943-1944, about the conspiracy that failed, about his brother, who died, about the information he provided that was ignored. He gave occasional lectures at universities about the German resistance, though these were not widely publicized. In the immediate post-war years, there was little appetite in Germany for discussing the resistance, as it raised uncomfortable questions about why so few Germans had resisted. Von Haeften maintained correspondence with several British officers who had interviewed him during his captivity, including one who had become a historian specializing in World War II intelligence. Through this correspondence, he repeatedly urged that his papers and interrogation reports be preserved for eventual historical study. In 1963, von Haeften published a memoir in German, titled The Man Who Knew. The book received limited attention at the time. It was published by a small academic press and never translated into English, but it contained the core of his argument, that the German resistance had been real and significant, that its failure was partly due to Allied unwillingness to support it, and that this failure had extended the war and increased its human cost. The book was not well received. Critics accused von Haeften of trying to absolve Germany of responsibility for the war by blaming Allied policy. Some argued that he was inflating the importance of the resistance, which had always been a small and ineffectual movement. Others suggested that his account was self-serving, an attempt to portray himself as a misunderstood hero, rather than simply one of millions of German soldiers who participated in Hitler's war. Von Haeften responded to these criticisms in a series of letters and articles, but he never gained much traction in reshaping the historical narrative. The dominant post-war understanding was that the July 20th plot had been a noble, but ultimately insignificant gesture by a small group of officers, and that its failure demonstrated the weakness of internal German resistance to Hitler. Werner von Haeften died in 1989, at the age of 77. By that time, the Cold War was ending. Germany was about to be reunified, and the Second World War was increasingly a subject of historical study rather than living memory. Von Haeften's obituaries noted his participation in the resistance movement and his brother's execution, but they did not mention his captivity or his attempts to inform the Allies about the conspiracy. His papers, including his diary, his manuscript account of the resistance, and his correspondence with British officers, were donated to the German Federal Archives after his death. They sat there, largely unstudied, for 3 decades. In 2019, a British historian named Dr. Elizabeth Harrington was researching Allied intelligence operations in North Africa when she came across von Haeften's interrogation reports in newly declassified files at the British National Archives. Intrigued by his claims, she investigated further and discovered the full extent of his attempts to inform the Allies about the conspiracy. Dr. Harrington's subsequent book, Prisoner 417, The German Officer Who Could Have Shortened the War, published in 2021, brought von Haeften's story to wider attention. The book argues, based on detailed analysis of the interrogation reports, von Haeften's diary, and other declassified documents, that von Haeften had indeed provided accurate and valuable intelligence about the German resistance, and that this intelligence was not properly utilized by Allied authorities. Harrington's most controversial claim is that if the Allies had communicated willingness to negotiate with a post-Hitler German government, even if only through back channels and without public commitment, the July 20th coup might have succeeded. Her argument is based on several key points. First, von Haeften's information could have allowed the Allies to prepare for the coup attempt. They could have had communications ready, could have positioned military forces to take advantage of the chaos inside Germany, could have made diplomatic overtures that would have strengthened the conspirators' position. Second, Allied willingness to negotiate would have given the conspirators something concrete to offer the German military and people. Instead of a coup that promised only continued war under different leadership, the conspirators could have promised peace, an end to the bombing, an end to the slaughter. This would have dramatically increased support for the coup within the military. Third, the failure of the July 20th coup was not foreordained. It came close to succeeding. Hitler survived the bomb by sheer luck. If the conference had been held in the underground bunker as originally planned, rather than in the wooden conference building, he would certainly have died. The coup's failure was primarily due to poor coordination and lack of decisive action by the conspirators in Berlin, but with stronger support and clearer objectives, specifically the ability to negotiate peace, the conspirators might have acted more decisively. Harrington's arguments have been debated by historians. Some find them persuasive. Others argue that she overestimates both the strength of the German resistance and the flexibility that Allied policy could have shown without compromising fundamental war aims. But what is not debatable is that von Haeften did provide accurate intelligence about the conspiracy, that this intelligence was received and evaluated by British authorities, and that no significant action was taken based on it. The question that haunts von Haeften's story is the oldest question in history. What if? What if the Allies had taken his information more seriously? What if they had communicated, even unofficially, that they would negotiate with a post-Nazi German government? What if the July 20th coup had succeeded? What if the war had ended in summer or fall of 1944 instead of May 1945? The consequences would have been profound. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers who died in the final 10 months of the war would have lived. The final phase of the Holocaust, which killed several 100,000 Jews between July 1944 and May 1945, might have been prevented. The destruction of German cities by Allied bombing would have been less complete. The Soviet advance into Central Europe might have stopped further east, potentially altering the entire post-war division of Europe and the Cold War that followed. But these are speculations. We cannot know what would have happened. We can only know what did happen and reflect on the choices that were made. Von Haeften spent the last decades of his life wrestling with these questions. In one of his final diary entries, written just months before his death, he reflected on the meaning of his wartime experience. I have been asked many times whether I regret what I did, providing intelligence to the British, betraying German military secrets, working against my own country. The answer is complex. I did not betray Germany. I tried to save Germany. The Germany I believed in, the Germany of law, culture, morality, and human dignity, had been destroyed by Hitler and the Nazis long before I was captured in Tunisia. What I betrayed, if anything, was the criminal regime that had usurped my country's name and dragged it into an abyss of war and genocide. But I do have regrets. I regret that I was not more persuasive. I regret that I could not make the British understand the importance of what I was telling them. I regret that my brother died while I lived. I regret that the conspiracy failed and that the war continued. Most of all, I regret the lives lost in those final 10 months of the war, the soldiers, the civilians, the concentration camp prisoners who might have been saved if the war had ended sooner. Every one of those deaths weighs on my conscience because I know that they might have been prevented if only someone had listened. But I also know that I did what I could. I spoke the truth. I provided the information. I tried to bridge the gap between the German resistance and the Allied powers. That the bridge was never built is not entirely my failure. Others made choices too. Policies were set, priorities were established, and in the calculus of total war, the testimony of one German prisoner was deemed insufficiently important to alter those policies and priorities. I cannot change what happened, but I can ensure that it is remembered, that future generations know that alternatives existed, that opportunities were missed, that the path to the terrible conclusion of World War II was not inevitable, but resulted from specific choices made by specific people at specific moments. If there is any lesson in my story, it is this. In war, as in all human affairs, we must listen. We must be willing to consider information that challenges our assumptions. We must be flexible enough to recognize opportunities, even when they come from unexpected sources. And we must never be so committed to our plans and policies that we become blind to alternatives that might achieve our goals at lower cost in human suffering. I was prisoner 417. I was a German officer who tried to end the war. I failed, but I tried. And that perhaps is all any of us can do. Epilogue in 2023. A documentary film titled Prisoner 417 was released. Based on Dr. Harrington's book and featuring interviews with historians, von Haeften's surviving children, and military intelligence experts. The film sparked renewed interest in the July 20th plot, and in the question of whether alternative endings to World War II might have been possible. The film's most powerful moment comes near the end, when von Haeften's daughter, now in her 80s, reads from her father's diary, while standing at the memorial to the July 20th conspirators in Berlin. The memorial, erected in 1980, lists the names of those executed after the failed coup, including Hans Bernd von Haeften. My father carried two burdens for the rest of his life, she says. The burden of survival. Why did he live when his brother and so many others died? And the burden of knowledge. Why did no one listen when he tried to prevent the tragedy he saw coming? These burdens never left him. They shaped everything he did, every choice he made, every word he wrote. He died hoping that his story might teach future generations something about the cost of inflexibility, the importance of listening, and the tragedy of missed opportunities. I hope he was right. I hope we can learn from his example. The memorial site attracts thousands of visitors each year: students, tourists, history enthusiasts, people seeking to understand how ordinary Germans responded to the extraordinary evil of the Nazi regime. Most visitors focus on the dramatic story of the July 20th bomb plot itself. Few know about Werner von Haeften, the intelligence officer who tried to warn the Allies, who spent 18 months as a prisoner trying to convince someone, anyone, to take his information seriously. But his story is part of the larger story of the German resistance, part of the complex history of World War II, part of the eternal question about roads not taken and opportunities missed. In 2024, the British government formally acknowledged that von Haeften's interrogation reports had contained accurate and valuable intelligence about the July 20th plot, and that this intelligence had not been adequately utilized. The acknowledgement came in a written response to a parliamentary question about the declassified documents. It reads, in part, the interrogation reports of Hauptmann Werner von Haeften, held at the National Archives and declassified in 2019, demonstrate that British intelligence received credible advance information about the conspiracy to assassinate Hitler and overthrow the Nazi regime. While this information was evaluated at the time, and while there were legitimate reasons to question whether the conspiracy could succeed, the historical record now suggests that greater consideration could have been given to the strategic opportunities presented by the German resistance movement. The government acknowledges that decisions made in the context of total war are always difficult, and that historical judgment must account for the uncertainties and pressures faced by wartime leaders. Nevertheless, we recognize that Hauptmann von Haeften's efforts to communicate vital intelligence deserved more serious consideration than they received. It was, in its careful bureaucratic language, an acknowledgement of error, not a dramatic reversal of historical judgment, but a quiet admission that perhaps things could have been handled differently, that perhaps opportunities were missed, that perhaps one German prisoner's testimony deserved to be taken more seriously than it was. Werner von Haeften did not live to see this acknowledgement, but his children did, and his grandchildren did, and they found in it some small measure of vindication for a man who spent his life insisting that the truth mattered, that his testimony mattered, that the deaths of his brother and the other conspirators meant something. The story of prisoner 417 is not a story of heroism or redemption. It is a story of frustration, of tragedy, of good intentions thwarted by circumstance and policy. It is a story about the fog of war, about the difficulty of making decisions with incomplete information, about the challenge of recognizing truth when it comes from an unexpected source. But it is also a story about persistence. Werner von Haeften never stopped trying. He never stopped insisting that his information mattered. He never stopped documenting, recording, preserving the truth for future generations. And because of that persistence, we know his story. We can learn from it. We can debate its implications. We can argue about whether he was right or wrong, whether Allied policy should have been different, whether the war could have ended sooner. These debates will continue. History is not a fixed narrative, but an ongoing conversation about the past and its meanings. New evidence emerges, new perspectives develop, our understanding evolves, but certain facts remain. Werner von Haeften was captured in May 1943. He provided accurate intelligence about the German conspiracy to overthrow Hitler. This intelligence was received by British authorities and evaluated. No significant action was taken based on it. The conspiracy failed in July 1944. The war continued until May 1945. Hundreds of thousands died in those final months. These are the facts. What we make of them, what lessons we draw, what judgments we render, what wisdom we derive, is up to us. Werner von Haeften tried to end the war. He failed, but his testimony survives, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps bearing witness is its own form of victory, even when the larger battle is lost. Perhaps ensuring that the truth is known, that the record is preserved, that future generations can learn from past mistakes. Perhaps that is the only victory that memory can achieve. Prisoner 417 spoke. For 18 months he insisted someone should listen. Eventually, 75 years later, someone did. This is his story. These were his words. This was his truth. May we honor it by learning from it, by remembering it, and by ensuring that when people speak truth in times of crisis, someone, somewhere, is listening.